Paulette.
Hi, it's good to see you.
You too.
Okay, and it looks like we're live.
All right, hello, welcome everyone. This is the finale for the Add1Challenge A1C39, and we're also going to be announcing the winners for A1C38. So as a part of the finale, we're going to answer a few of the questions that you've submitted to us prior to the finale, and we'll also select the winners of our 3 challenges and let the finalists that are joining us today ask our panelists questions as well. But before we get started, I want to take a moment to give our panelists and finalists an opportunity to introduce themselves. So today, our polyglot panel includes Tetsu Young. Tetsu, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Hi, yes, my name is Tetsu Young, polyglot, multilingual, well, whatever. I speak a few languages since birth, since I grew up in Taiwan, where I am right now. Actually, it's actually 2 a.m. Past 2 a.m. here in Taiwan. So greetings from Taiwan. I also head up a language festival in Montreal. So if anybody are in Montreal this August, that's also something that I like. So my life is revolving around revolving around languages. Also my children, raising them in multilingual environments. So welcome to all.
And Benny?
Yes, so I am Benny. I've started Flute in 3 months, and I'm actually going to be hanging out with Tetsu in a couple of weeks at Langfest. I'm really looking forward to that. And of course, I've taken over the Add1Challenge from Brian Kwong, and I'm just so happy with how it's been going. It's always extremely inspirational to see people making the kind of progress that they make, and I'm really glad that I could help to get this all together. But of course, the biggest thanks goes to Shannon, because she's doing the majority of the work in pushing the community forward.
All right, I'm going to introduce all of our I'm going to have our finalists introduce themselves in just a moment. But first, I just want to acknowledge those who made it to the finals in A1C38 who are not here today. It's Mark, who learned Chinese, OJ, who learned Spanish, Guy, who learned Chinese as well, and Marjorie, who learned Spanish, and Hazel, who learned Arabic. So those are our finalists from A1C38. And our finalists from A1C39 are Jayshane, Nick, and Katrina, and our finalists for Add1 Advance are Paulette and Charles. So Charles isn't here with us today, but I'm going to go through kind of in the order that I see you guys right to left. So let us know who you are, what language you learned, and what the biggest thing you got out of Add1 was. So I see Paulette first. So Paulette, do you want to go?
Hi, yeah, so my name is Paulette, and I was doing Add1 Advance. I've been learning French for a long time. I'm from Canada, but I'm an English speaker. So I had this slightly baggage-laden legacy of taking French in school and not getting very far. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I really came back to it. And the Add1Challenge was a huge part of me, I guess, getting over my issues with French and really finding a way of learning that was much more personalized and was much more organized. I think for me, a huge part of what I got out of the Add1Challenge was a sense of believing that it was actually possible. I mean, I think when you've been struggling with a language for a really long time, a lot of it is the mentality. You start to think that it's not possible. And even when you're putting in the time and you're doing the work, you don't really believe. And the Add1Challenge, I feel like one day I just had this epiphany that it's going to work. And I don't know if it's going to take a year or 5 years, but I know that if I keep working on it, I am going to get to my goal. So for me, and developing that perspective was a huge victory. And also just the community. The community was really supportive. We had so many interesting discussions about resources and how do people learn and how does memory work and phonetics and how do you make that trill sound in Spanish with your tongue and like where do you put your tongue and all these really interesting specific conversations with really interesting people. So for me, it was just a really good way to feel good about learning and to sort of find my voice and find my belief in myself in French. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Nick, I see you next.
Okay, so I was learning Ukrainian in this challenge, and it was my first Add1 challenge, and I just started the Add141 with the advanced version to continue that as well. And I found it really useful to be in a community of like-minded people, and to be able to bounce ideas off people and get support when it was necessary. And that was really useful because there's not that many resources for Ukrainian. So to get ideas about how other people who are learning languages for which there are not many resources operated, that was definitely very useful. And I feel like I made a huge amount of progress that I probably wouldn't have made in the same time frame if I weren't part of the challenge. And I'm looking forward to seeing how the remainder of the next challenge, how far I can go in that as well. So thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Jayshanay?
Hey guys, I'm Jayshanay. I'm from the US and I've been wanting to learn Spanish for years and would never kind of get beyond the hi, my name is part of it. Of course, I took Spanish in middle school, but I couldn't remember anything that I'd learned. And every time that I would try, I wasn't really getting anywhere with it. And so I would kind of give it up. But when I joined Add1, so this is my first Add1 challenge. When I joined Add1, the sense of kind of camaraderie and everybody working towards a similar goal and rooting for you and checking in on you and, you know, having a support system the way that we did for Add1 really kind of continued to make me like I had progress every step of the way. So that was one of the best phenomenal parts of Add1 for me.
Great, thank you. Katrina?
Yeah, hi, I'm Katrina. I was learning Korean for this challenge. I started learning Korean last year around Thanksgiving, and in a few months leading up to actually starting the challenge, I learned lots and lots of random words. Like, I'm really good at learning random words. And at the start of the challenge, I really couldn't say anything. I couldn't communicate. I couldn't have even the simplest conversation beyond just, you know, hello, nice to meet you. And the challenge, so I think my biggest trouble with learning Korean was that all of the resources that are out there, there are a lot of resources, but they're all very similar to each other. They're all very based on grammar, and I don't seem to learn very well through grammar. And so what the challenge let me do is really find the support in the community to explore all the other ways that people learn languages and really find ways of learning that match my learning style. And throughout the 3 months, like, I kept feeling that the language was being just a little bit unlocked. And so now I feel like I can have conversations. They're very simple about, like, how many buttons is the cat, you know, wearing in his hat or whatever, but I can have that conversation even fairly fluently in Korean. And so that was just, it was an amazing experience to feel that being unlocked.
Thank you. All right, we'll go ahead and open it up for you all to ask Tetsu, Benny, or I any questions that you have about language learning or whatever you like. So if you have a question, just go ahead and unmute your microphone and jump in.
So I do. What was the most difficult part of your first successful language learning journey?
Okay. Tetsu, do you want to take this first?
Successful. All right. I grew up in a few languages as I was born to a Taiwanese father and a Japanese mother. I went to an American school, and I moved to Canada in Quebec. So I actually grew up with quite a few languages. So that was kind of just an automatic process. But the first language that I actually learned, like actively studied and learned, was Spanish. And I don't know. I think learning grammar and all that was dry and boring. But actual community and actual talking to people was the fun part that really got me going, and a lot of partying and lots of traveling that allowed me to make that into a successful thing. But yeah, so the obstacles were things that you had to go over, whether it's grammar or actually, finding the resources and whatnot. Although Spanish was relatively easy, but in those days, when I was studying, I was still using cassettes and whatnot. So it's not as easy as today, but still, I think it was okay.
For me, it was that I'm really shy and extremely introverted. So starting to use the languages that I studied with other people was a really big hurdle for me to get over. I just did not want to do it. So I tried everything I possibly could to avoid talking to other people. And it was actually not until I started doing Benny's Speak from Day One course that I decided to kind of get over that. And I was learning Chinese at the time. So on the internet somewhere floating around, you can actually see the first videos of me ever speaking Chinese. And that kind of eventually helped me build up the confidence to start booking lessons on italki and using the languages that I was learning with other people. But it's still something that I struggle with. And because I'm so introverted and so shy, it's still uncomfortable for me. But I know what the value of pushing myself to do it is. So I just kind of deal with that discomfort and, have those conversations and meet new people. And even though it's hard, it's worth it. So I just kind of continue to work through it. So to give you guys time to think of a few more questions, I'm actually going to jump over to the chat. And there's a question there from Roger, who is actually one of the Add1 participants. And he asks, when is it appropriate to switch to a new language to meet your goal of learning more than 2 or 3 languages? What level of competency should one pursue before adding the next language? So Tetsu or Benny, if you want to jump in on that.
Tetsu, do you have, because what I say pretty much in every single one of these Add1Challenge calls. So what would you say, Tetsu?
I tried, actually going, taking a few languages at when I did my Spanish, I went to a certain level relatively quickly, and I got overconfident, and I sort of jumped into German and then take Italian at the same time, and I sort of, I think, overwhelmed myself with language learning when I was in my early 20s. So it didn't go very well, I guess, from my expectations perspective for those languages. But it really comes down to a personal choice. So that's where I think, expectations is an important thing. What do you want to do with that language, and how far you want to take it? So if you really want to go deep, then I think you need to concentrate on one language. If you want to be, able to travel around and make friends quickly and have relatively simple conversations, then I wouldn't mind just taking on 2 or 3 languages. Also, if they're relatively simple or relatively close languages. So there are a lot of parameters, I think, a lot of variables that you need to consider. But the most important one is, what do you expect out of this language or the languages that you want to learn? Is that a good answer?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is it's an interesting question, because it actually comes up almost every time we do one of these live Q&As. Is how can I manage this process of learning more than one language? And what I've settled on myself, I do think that there are people who can successfully learn 2 languages. And like you said yourself, Tetsu, if you're traveling, then that changes the scenario for how much work you can put into each language. But for me personally, I am very bad at multitasking. I can't even have a conversation while I'm driving, for instance. That's how bad I am. So when it comes to projects, I can't really do 2 projects at the same time. And especially with languages, and especially if they're similar, they're going to bleed into one another. So my personal process that I'd have recommended to people who wouldn't self-identify as naturally talented in languages, and especially adults getting into their first foreign languages, would be to definitely focus on one language until you get it up until at least the B2 level on the European Common Framework. So this effectively means that you are you're socially equivalent to how you would be in your native language. You're at the upper intermediate level, and you can socialize in the language without having to have the other people slow down very much for your benefit. So you're not at perfection yet, but you are at a very high level. And for me personally, when I reach that level, something happens in my brain that I kind of have like this strong wall around the language. So I can start a new language, and the new language doesn't kind of seep into that. And as I'm learning that new language, I'll definitely still mix things up, and my other language will bleed into that, because that doesn't have any strong walls around it, as it were. But the original first language that I learned is going to be like kept more or less isolated in my mind, and I won't mix things up. And that only happens when I push it up to a very reasonable upper intermediate level. And that's what I highly recommend for other people, to not do 2 languages at once. If you have long-term goals, if you have short-term goals, you're going to go to European countries and you want to spend a week in France, a week in Spain, then you learn a few phrases, and it's not really going to be that big a deal. But if you have bigger long-term goals, definitely try to focus on one language.
All right, Nick, you had a question?
Yeah, I was wondering what the panel do to go from intermediate to advanced level in languages, especially if the language doesn't have that many resources. Because I know some people use the CEFA exams, and that gives them something to work towards. But for Ukrainian, for example, there's no exams like that anywhere.
Yeah, well, what I would suggest is you say there's no resources, and what that really means is there's no downloadable resources. There's not so many book resources, but there definitely are resources of native speakers. And what I tend to do is find for the upper levels, the C levels of a language, when I feel like I'm ready for it. If it's a European language, I've loads of resources, but I also would spend as much time as possible with a professional teacher. So you're not necessarily going to just have conversations, because just general conversations with people who are patient and they want to help you, that won't get you to the C levels, because they're not going to scrutinize your language skills to the extent that you need it to be scrutinized. I would still see if there are equivalent exams, even if they're not necessarily like going to be called C2, or like just some kind of high-level exam in the language that you could have as a thing to work towards, just because the academic restrictions around that would give some kind of actual targets that you can work with your teacher. But otherwise, you can just split it up the same way the European ones are, that you're working on your speaking, your reading, your writing, and your listening skills. So for the speaking skills, you're going to have very complex conversations with your teacher. For the reading and writing skills, she or he would assign you tasks that they know, and this is why you really should, at that stage, have a professional teacher who's very good at helping people really refine their level. And you will find that for especially a language like Ukrainian, as few resources as it may have, there are still millions of people who speak it. So you're able to find one of those people who would be professionally able to help you advance in your level. And then they would also potentially have their own resources. They may have created their own mini course, and they may have their own like PDFs that they'll email you that you can work on between lessons. So you may actually find that even a single person could give you a wealth of resources. That's what I would suggest for, because like obviously I don't know any Ukrainian, I haven't learned it yet, so I can't tell you what the resources are, but the people who speak it natively, and also fellow learners who've learned Ukrainian, they would tell you, actually, this is great, that's great, this is good. So the other people, they are your resource, is what I would say.
Thank you.
I'm going to jump in really quickly on this one. If I'm at an intermediate level, I'm probably ready to start using native resources. So I would actually get books in Ukrainian, for example, or I'd start listening to more music, or I would see if I could find any video games where Ukrainian is a supported language and play those. I would watch movies, I would watch TV shows. And at the intermediate stage, you'll know enough of the language to kind of have a foothold in those sorts of things. And, you know, if you're learning Ukrainian, for example, Link is available. Steve Kaufman studied Ukrainian. And so, you know, you could find ebooks and import them into Link and start reading without assistance. So there are, so things like that would be something that I would kind of dive into more fully at that stage. Tetsu, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, both of you just touched upon all the points that I would have done. I guess, you know, speaking of Steve Kaufman, what I would keep in mind is to really find material that you're interested in. So this is comprehensible input. I did that when I was learning Spanish. When I pushed the envelope, I guess, to quite advanced levels. I was reading everything in Spanish. I was even taking notes. When I was taking, you know, at the university, I was taking notes in Spanish, you know, listening to a lecture in English. So just immerse yourself in your language and just use it as much as possible, and with native material as much as possible. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, Paulette, you had a question?
Yeah, it's funny. It actually relates. Tetsu, you were just mentioning listening to a lecture in English and taking notes in Spanish. And Benny earlier said that he's not good at multitasking. And so my question is actually having to do with switching languages. So in my daily life, I use Spanish at work, and English is my native language. That's what I speak at home. And I find that I have like a switching delay when I switch from one language to another. You know, before I have a French lesson on italki, or I have a weekly Skype call with a friend of mine where we speak French, I feel like I have to listen to 15 minutes of a French podcast or something to kind of switch my brain over into French mode. Or if I'm going to go see my in-laws and we're going to be speaking Russian, I feel like I have a delay. Like it takes me a while to switch gears. And if I don't switch gears properly, I feel like my pronunciation isn't as good, my flow isn't as good. And I feel like I'm just not very good at switching between languages like that. And I see other people who are really good at it. You know, they can turn to one person and talk to them in one language and, you know, immediately turn to a different person and talk to them in a different language. Perfect pronunciation, everything is great. Is that just something that people develop over time naturally, or is there something that you can do to specifically develop that skill? Like, is that a skill that you can target for development or not?
That's an excellent question, but I'm not sure if I can answer that.
I've got an answer for this.
Go for it, Benny.
So when I had learned a little Spanish, French, and Portuguese, I was reaching this exactly what you just described, that I could speak one of them, and it would take me quite a little bit of time to switch to the next one. And I would see other people doing it quickly, and I would think, is there is this the limit I've reached where there is a gene and I just don't have it? And as with everything, it's like I don't think there are limitations to that extent. So what I did was I actually had, in essence, a 3-month project to just learn how to switch languages quickly. And rather than, so in essence, it's its own skill. And for me, it was its own separate skill that even though my level of the languages, by themselves in a box may be great for having conversations, there was that delay that I had. So what I did personally was I intentionally went to as many multilingual meetups as I could. So there's in many cities there are lots of events run by the likes of Mundley and so on that you gather people from who are learning different languages. There are meetups on meetup.com. I used to go to a lot of couchsurfing meetings where there were people traveling through, and during those meetings, I had to deal with this. And this wasn't something that I necessarily had a process for, but the process was as much exposure to multiple languages in the same evening. And it was, it kind of felt like as I would switch from one language to another, initially it was like there was a crowd of workers in my head, like dashing across and like turning the gears and pressing all the buttons so that the language could switch. And it was exhausting. But with time, at the end of that intensive 3 months, now I could reach the stage where I can actually switch with relative ease, depending on the situation. I still have issues where if I haven't practiced a language for a very long time, I do actually still struggle with switching back to it. But that's more a case of using it consistently rather than the switching itself being the problem. So I would recommend that you go out of your way to find those situations, and you'll actually find you'll develop this skill. And that's what I would suggest.
So Benny, so intuitively, I would think that it has to do with how well you master that language, or the two languages that you're trying to switch between. But you're saying there's a separate skill. So you can be at intermediate in both languages, but still switch very smoothly, whereas
Absolutely.
another person could be in advanced, but not switch very, very smoothly.
Yeah, so the person who's advanced, they would be able to have advanced conversations, but they would probably need the 10 minutes to make that adjustment. Whereas when I had this particular project, I was only at intermediate level, but at the end of this 3 months, I was able to more or less smoothly switch from Spanish to Portuguese, especially those two, which were quite close, that was my biggest priority. And I was doing this in Brazil, so I was able to practice tons of Portuguese with everybody, but I went out of my way to find, it just so happened that there were a lot of Argentine tourists in the part of Brazil that I was at. So I went out of my way to find them, and I would speak Portuñol with them, and they would point it out to me, the mistakes I was making, and then I'd switch back to Portuguese and I'd say words like mais grande, which doesn't exist in Portuguese, and they would correct me because I was saying it from my Spanish influence. And it was a little bit of correction, obviously. It helps when people are pointing out when you're mixing the languages up, but also just that process of moving from one to the other. And I was aware of the fact that I was speaking a very Spanish Portuguese, and learning how to separate that was a separate skill to just improving my Spanish and just improving my Portuguese.
My experience. Oh, Go ahead, Tetsu.
No, it's okay. Go
My
ahead.
experience has been the same as Benny. If I don't practice switching between languages, I'm not comfortable doing it. So for me, actually deliberately practicing this switch, like putting myself in situations where I need to do this, helps me build that ability to do it. I think that your level can affect this to a certain degree, but it's also something that if you kind of, work on this intentionally, that you can develop the ability to do it with greater ease. So Tetsu, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask the question back to Paulette, whether there's actually whether this delay was a translational delay in that, are you actually translating from English to French or French to English, or because when I speak Spanish, I think in Spanish. That's why I'm able to listen to a lecture in English, but write down in Spanish. I kind of wonder, is that multitasking? Don't really think so, but it does allow me to concentrate on the class because I have to understand what the professor's saying.
I would say multitasking in a way is when you're trying to do two things that have some form of difficulty to them. So it's why I would not be able to learn two languages at the same time, because that requires a certain amount of effort. But what you just described, I would be able to do that theoretically, because if my level, I haven't tried it, but if my level of the language is high enough, which would be in Spanish, then it is more natural for me to write. I mean, if anything, that specific writing down in Spanish what I'm hearing in English, that is its own little skill that I would take time to practice and get better at, because in a way it's kind of like live interpreting, which requires a bit of practice.
I guess so.
So it's not necessarily multitasking, but it's like for anything, like people learn how to do one thing so well that it just becomes automatic to them.
And to answer your question really quickly, my problem is a lot more what Benny described. Is when I'm speaking French, I'm thinking in French. And that's actually my problem, is that I feel like I can't think in two languages at the same time. So I can think in English, or I can switch to thinking in French. And that's my goal. This is when I'm speaking in French, I want to be thinking in French. But I feel like I can't think in two languages simultaneously. And so it takes me a while for my brain to switch over from thinking in English to thinking in French. And then once I'm in thinking in French mode, I actually, I go to talk to my partner and I accidentally say things in French and I don't even realize, I meant to speak English and French just comes out. And so those are the sorts of difficulties that I mean. And I feel like you're right. I just probably need to specifically practice that, as opposed to, I've always just thought of it as something that I'm not very good at. And so I try to.
No, I would absolutely say it's not. It's just a skill to learn, and I cannot do two languages at the same time. So if I'm speaking in Spanish and someone asks me a question in French, and I'm not expecting it, that's going to throw me off. I'm going to initially be thinking those are weird Spanish words, and then after a second I'm going to be like, oh, hold on, that was French, and then I turn the gears, and then I'm in French mode, and then I kind of replay it in my mind. So I can't deal with two languages at the same time. And it's actually one challenge of being a polyglot on the internet, and people know I speak multiple languages, is they don't realize that when they come up to me and immediately speak to me in a language, that I am actually thrown off of it, because I'm like, oh, hold on, what language is this? Okay, it's that language. And it takes me a couple of seconds, especially when it's forced on me. So I definitely cannot do two languages at once, and that's including the languages that I'm best at. So it is indeed a skill that you can develop, and I'm just faster at it now than I was initially.
Wow, it's quite interesting. Maybe because I grew up with 4 or 5 languages ever since my childhood, that it's a skill that was already well practiced. I've never really realized, even in languages that I'm relatively weak at. I mean, I still can just switch around. So interesting observation. Thank you.
Shannon, you had a question?
I do. As a high beginner, low intermediate learner, I recently was on a call with a teacher, and the teacher suggested that I work on speaking faster. What things could a language learner at my level do to increase like the speed or the flow during conversation?
What do you guys
Because
think?
Well, I've never heard that really. To increase your speed, as in speak faster, you know, like this, and then we go down.
Right. That's what I was told.
I don't know.
I wouldn't. I personally wouldn't say it's urgent, especially at the upper beginner, lower intermediate stage. Like if you want to, if the teacher is suggesting this, what I have found that helps me improve my speed is trying to sing along to music, or at least reading something that I've already read before, because the predictability means I'm not tripping over my words as much. Whereas if I was to speak to you now in Spanish and any other language, and I was intentionally trying to make it faster, that would be hard for me, because I would think too slowly, and then I would be forcing myself to say unnatural words. So I think I wouldn't recommend it as a process, but I would say that if it's something you can work on, you could, for instance, maybe come up with a script about yourself, that intro about who you are and so on. And it's the kind of thing you're likely to say often when you first meet people, and then try to say that quickly. And that is something you can practice, and you kind of can get into the routine of it. And it'll influence, because they are phrases you're likely to use often, you will be able to say them faster with that practice in other situations.
I'm curious if your teacher's concern isn't so much with speed as with flow, because they may seem like the same thing, but they're actually two completely different things. So speed is how quickly you speak, whereas flow is how smoothly you speak. And I think that your teacher may have meant flow and not necessarily speed. And so flow would be more like cutting things out, like hesitations, and having your speech flow. And that comes like that you can improve, like Benny said, with scripting and with practice, and kind of becoming more confident in certain conversation topics that come up. So the issues would kind of be resolved in the same way, but I don't think building up speaking speed is as important as building speaking flow, just because it helps, you know, other people understand you a little bit better when you're communicating with them, and that will kind of help things run more smoothly in your conversations. So I think that that might actually be what your tutor meant, but it's not necessarily speed but flow.
Right.
Yeah. Like one thing I've mentioned on the blog a couple of times is that I do try to work on my flow when it comes to reducing my hesitation, but my speed is actually the same. So this thing I always talk about, that I try to sound like Captain Jack Sparrow, where I put in dramatic pauses, I'm still using that time to think in my head, what was that word again? But it sounds less awkward, because it's actually a trick in oration that people have. Whenever you're giving a speech, you sound more intelligent if you put in a pause to emphasize a point. So it's not actually speaking faster. It's like Shannon said, that's just flow. And it's frustrating if a teacher just says, hey, stop saying If someone says that to me, that is not going to work for me. That kind of instruction, I can't stop saying It's not like I'm actively trying to say it, you know. But what I can do is I can think of a different way of having that hesitation, you know. So that's kind of what I always tell people is I just try to kind of make it like a dramatic moment, and that was my way of dealing with it. You don't necessarily need to do that same thing, but try to see how would you handle another way of filling that time. And even instead of you can use the language's natural pauses. So in English, we do this all the time. We say, you know, and then and you can just use the equivalents in that language, and it sounds natural, but you're still, in a way, you're still hesitating, but your flow is just so much more smooth, and it sounds like it doesn't sound like you're struggling with what you're saying.
Right.
So here's an additional thought, and I think Shannon really put things together for me to understand what exactly what I wasn't understanding in this advice from your tutor. And yeah, precisely. I think the flow is what we're aiming for, not speed. In fact, I think everybody has a natural speaking speed. I mean, some people just speak very fast, and some people are always very slow. But it's just a thing, it's a personal thing. But regarding the speed, the relationship between speed and flow, I would even say slow down if you want a better flow. That gives you that extra, time to think of every word that you're trying to put out there. So if anything, I would slow down and try to speak without the pauses and the little breaks and whatnot. My 2 cents.
Thanks, guys.
We're going to announce the winners in just a moment, but before we do, Benny or Tetsu, do you have any final words of encouragement for our finalists and other challengers?
Well, we've all been through it. We all know that language learning is a tremendous, project for anybody. So before you announce the winners, I definitely applaud every single one of you guys. It was inspirational for me to go through all the videos, and it's very interesting to watch, and a learning process a learning experience for me too. So congratulations to all.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I would say that it's one of the greatest things about the Add1Challenge is not only that you're getting support, but that you're seeing other people's process and seeing that they go through similar struggles. Because there is this this concept we all have that it's so easy for them to switch languages. It's so easy for him to learn Spanish. It's so easy for her to learn French. And we see this kind of idealized version of other people's story. And actually, pretty much everyone goes through their own struggles in different forms, in different ways. But I really like that in our community, you will see people openly talk about these things. So everyone who's watching, it's great that you've shared your journey with others. You would actually be surprised with how many people you have inspired. And I hope anyone else who's watching this can think to themselves that try to just always compare to yourself yesterday. Don't compare to other people, because you're seeing a filtered version of that. And I guarantee you those other people are going through struggles that you are not aware of, which they are just not sharing with you, or is not as clear in their journey. So everyone goes through struggles, and it's okay if it's a difficult process for you.
All right. Our Add1 winners for today will each receive $250 in italki credits, as well as admission to their next Add1. And our 2 Add1 advanced winners today are going to receive 6 months of link, as well as admission to their next Add1. So I'll go ahead and announce the A1C38 winners. Our Add1 winner is Mark, who studied Chinese, and our Add1 advanced winner is Hazel, who learned Arabic. And for A1C39, our Add1 winner is Nick. So Nick, you won $250 in italki credits, as well as admission to your next Add1. And our winner for Add1 Advance is Charles. Charles couldn't join the call today, but he learned Italian in Add1 Advance, and he is our Add1 Advance winner. So I want to thank all of you who are here with us today for all of your great questions. Thank you, Tetsu and Benny, for joining and answering those questions. So if you have any questions for us, you can go to add1challenge.com and you'll find out how to get in touch with us, and you'll find more information about Add1 if you too would like to have a 15-minute conversation in your new language. Tetsu and Benny, did you want to share where people could find more information about you if they're interested in looking you up after this call?
Well, I would definitely ask everybody to check out 2 websites. Well, one is asktetsu.com, so you can continue to ask me questions about anything language related, and especially about raising multilingual children, which is which is my specialty, I guess. And the second website I'd ask you to look up is langfest.org, which is the language festival that's taking place on August 23rd to 25th in Montreal. So that's in 2 weeks and a bit. So still time. Definitely check it out if you're interested. Come on down and join us.
Yep, and I'll just kind of conclude also to say that everyone who in the challenge who didn't win the final prize, something you should know is sometimes when we select someone, it's actually because of the difficulties that they went through. So in a way, the people who were not the final winners, you actually did so much better in so many ways. And in a way, we want to kind of reward the challenges people go through. So you should be really proud of where you've made it and the results that you've gotten. And believe it or not, if you weren't picked, it might have actually been for a very good reason that you would be happy to hear, because in a way, sometimes you're like, oh, this comes easy to her, you know. And that's something that you should always think of, that you're actually showing that you are a natural in language learning, and that's something I want you guys to keep in mind when it comes to all of this. But otherwise, if you want to find me online and stuff, I'll be you just go to my main YouTube channel, which is just type Benny Lewis. I'm going to be relaunching that very soon. I've got lots of fun videos coming out there. And otherwise, Fluent in 3 months, the website, check it out. The email list is where we share all of our best tips. And I'm on all the other social medias. I'm on, as I like to say, I'm on the Twinsta Snap Talk. It's all Irish polyglot on Twinsta Snap Talk.
All right. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. And thank you to all of our finalists and panelists. And we hope to see you in a future Add1.
Happy language learning, everyone.
Thanks, guys.